Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. My name is Tilly and I am a strength and conditioning coach and an exercise scientist. If you're new here, welcome. You are in for an absolute treat today. On this channel, I talk about a range of different sports science topics and then I dive into the research behind all of them. So if you see anything that you like today, it would be amazing if you could like and subscribe because I would truly appreciate the support and I would absolutely love to have you be a part of our little community. Now let's get into today's juicy topic. We're going to be talking about sex. More specifically, we're going to be talking about whether or not sex has an impact on athletic performance. We're going to explore what the effects may be and whether or not abstinence before competition is necessary to achieve success. Now, the underlying idea that I have heard from some athletes and some coaches is that removing sex from an athlete's pre-game ritual causes an increase in aggression and sexual frustration. And the idea is that hopefully this can be translated into better performance. If you're more aggressive and more ready to go. It's also purported that sex can cause athletes to lose their focus or it can hinder their recovery, and so coaches often prescribe abstinence. And this goes back to ancient times where Roman and Greek educators purported that great successes only come when great sacrifices were made. Some coaches also don't like their athletes partaking in sex before they go into a match or before their competitive performance because they think it affects their recovery simply because it's an additional energy expenditure. And just before we get into everything, I'm going to quickly dispel this. Obviously, this varies for everybody, but it's a pretty commonly cited statistic that a bout of sexual intercourse only burns about 25 calories. How sex might actually affect your recovery is by causing a lack of sleep. A lack of sleep has the ability to cause issues with cognition, reaction time, coordination, and ultimately sports performance. Although this could be combated by just having sex earlier in the night. Researchers have also suggested that another reason sex might be bad for performance is that because amongst athletes, particularly those in team sports, sex might be accompanied by other activities that are bad for recovery, such as drinking, smoking tobacco, or drugs. Obviously, this is a massive generalization, but I suppose it is the case for some people, and so it does warrant a mention. Now, those are the general concerns as to why athletes or coaches might choose to abstain from sex before competition, but let's have a look at some top-level athletes and see what they think about the whole situation. While obviously there's a huge variation in opinions and there's a huge variety of sports and different athletes, but pretty commonly fighters such as MMA or boxing athletes seem to have a pretty strong opinion on this one way or the other. Ronda Rousey, the UFC fighter, famously says that before a fight, she tries to have as much sex as possible.
You have sex, it raises your testosterone. So it kind of sucks I don't have a boyfriend right now.
This might be the case, but whether or not those acute changes in hormone levels actually affect performance is widely debated. So wouldn't buy into it just yet. It's been reported that Muhammad Ali would abstain for sex for 6-week windows prior to a fight. And I mean, this is pretty intense, but it seemed to work for him. Tyson Fury also has some interesting opinions on both ends of the spectrum. He has previously had an incredibly strict regime of masturbating 7 times a day prior to his fight with Deontay Wilder. 7 times a day.
7 times. Keep me testosterone pumping. Pumping, 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 pump it up.
But then more recently, he went on a complete sex and masturbation ban. He said no shagging before fights. That's a myth. Don't believe it. But my dick will be in my pants. It's in there more or less full time, but it might be coming out after the fight. I don't believe in sex in training camp. I'm an old school fighter, and I like to keep nice and strong, keep it all in the tank, and then take out all the aggression on the night. So you see, that's kind of perpetuating that myth that it increases aggression and frustration, right? During COVID, NBA players were placed in a bubble. LeBron James famously said that it felt like a prison. And ESPN reports that it was absolutely wild to expect these athletes to go a period of time abstaining from sex. I mean, I think that COVID was a little more wild than this expectation, but I mean, sure. In 2014, the Mexican soccer team announced that it would be asking its players to abstain from sex prior to the World Cup in Brazil, in the hopes that this would maximize their athletic performance. Their coach said at the time, if a player can't go 1 month or 20 days without having sexual relations, then they are not prepared to be a professional player. 40 days of sexual abstinence isn't going to hurt anyone. Real quick went from 20 to 40. How long did they actually have to do it? Does anyone else think it's weird that coaches or people in positions of authority are able to imprint their own personal beliefs on somebody, even though it's not necessarily backed by science? Unfortunately, the Mexican soccer team lost in round 16, as they had in every World Cup since 1994. In my last example, showing how athletes approach sex, it's worth mentioning that in the 2016 Olympics in Rio, the Olympic Village was given 450,000 condoms so that the athletes could partake in safe sex.
450,000!
Now these are competitors at the literal pinnacle of sport. I mean, we even have the quote, "What happens in the Olympic Village stays in the village." Do you think that this is indicative of the fact that Olympians or their coaches believe that abstinence before competition is helpful? Now, okay, those are some great examples, but let's have a look at some actual research and let's see if any of these claims are backed by the literature. Some of this research goes back to the 1960s, which is awesome. In 1968, Johnson found that sexual intercourse had no influence on muscle strength. In 1975, some researchers found that sex exerted no effect on coordination or VO2 max. VO2 max is just a measure of aerobic fitness for those of us who are unaware. In 1995, Boone and Gilmore found something interesting. They saw that when sex was had over 10 hours before competition, there was no negative effect on performance. However, when sex was had less than 2 hours before competition, there was a negative effect. On a similar note, in 1997, Fisher et al. Compared two different sports. They compared baseball and American football players at a varsity level. They found that the football players practiced abstinence more frequently than the baseball players, and the researchers concluded that possible positive results on their performance may have resulted from more frequent abstinence before competition. Now, it is important to note that this conclusion was drawn based on the players' own perceptions of sex and how it affected their athletic performance. So there wasn't like a clear effect that they saw, but they were just reporting what the players reported. In 2015, a study showed that some athletes showed worse or improved performance after intercourse, but no systematic effect of sexual intercourse was demonstrated. I mean, we're kind of in that gray area, right? Nothing really positive, nothing really negative. Some more data are available on the possible psychological impact of sexual activity on athletic performance. And all of those results seem to report a positive impact or at worst, no impact. So it's not really something that is detrimental to performance, but it's pretty individual as to whether or not it improves your performance or does nothing at all. Again, I wish this was more black and white, but it's kind of gray and a little inconclusive. It's also worth mentioning that there was not really any data on masturbation, and mostly people who identified as men, so male athletes, were studied. There were not really any women in these studies. There were a couple that I found that did include women, but it wasn't the majority. All of the literature seems to indicate that sex before performance is a really personal thing, and this is what some of us like to call, the science. Lots of this research is anecdotal, it's poorly done, and honestly mostly unsubstantiated. What I mean by that is that researchers in this area often fail to account for food intake, sleep, training practices at the time, recovery practices at the time. So there's a lot of confounding variables. Nevertheless, I thought it would be a good idea to summarize everything that I learned from the papers that I looked at for this video. So let's talk about when the research says we should avoid sex. Well, like I mentioned, we should avoid it within that 2-hour window before competition. We should also probably skip out on the pre-game sex brigades if it affects our sleep. We should also probably skip out on sex if it is something that causes you to overthink or get anxious or nervous. Or if it causes you discomfort, then it's probably not the best thing to be doing right before a match or some sort of competitive event where you have to perform your best. If you're at a level of sport where you have people analyzing your match performance, then maybe you could try a little experiment of your own. You could have sex before a match and see if it impacts your performance, or you could abstain from sex before a match and see if it impacts your performance. You should be able to then have some pretty clear quantitative data to see whether or not sex affects your performance. If it doesn't, then maybe it's time to put this myth to bed. And this last point, which has been echoed throughout the literature, is that you should probably abstain from sex before competition if it is not something that you normally do. If you normally have sex once a month or something, then it's probably best not to have that one time be right before a match. This might have something to do with the idea idea that our body may not be adapted to the demands of intimacy. Or it could be related to the inverted U hypothesis of arousal in sports psychology. Simply put, the inverted U theory suggests that for a sporting event, there is an optimal level of excitement and arousal that we should have. We do need to have some excitement or nervousness, but too much and we slip into that realm of panic and we're not going to perform well. On the opposite side, if we're not excited at all, we're not nervous at all, and we're calm and bored, then we also won't perform well. So you want to fit somewhere in the middle of that curve. Some researchers have considered how this hypothesis relates to sex and athletic performance, and they've explained it much better than me, so I'm going to read to you what they've said now. They said, considering the inverted U sports psychology hypothesis, the frustration from prolonged abstinence can promote the desire to better athletic activity, while being sufficiently fulfilled sexually can reduce such desire for better sports performance. There is an optimal level of alertness or anxiety before a competition, and therefore sex may produce a relaxing distraction effect the night before the competition. So you can see at the start of that quote, we've got the idea that maybe frustration might be related to better performance, and then at the end of that quote, we've got an example of how sex might be really beneficial. I think this inverted U hypothesis honestly could be used either way to explain why abstinence or sex is beneficial for sporting performance. But now let's look at when the research says we should have sex. Ready for some more science? We should have sex if we want to. If you feel like sex is something that your body and your mind want, you feel comfortable, and you know you'll feel good afterwards, then what's the harm? There's also probably no issue having sex before performance if it's something that you regularly do. And I know I've said this 100 times, but if you regularly have sex and you want to start implementing abstinence for whatever reason, then right before a game might not be the best time to try out something new. It's a better idea to maybe try out new rituals or new pre-game practices before training. Do it for a while, then you could try it out before a game or something. But right before an important match is just generally not the best time to change up your routine or do something that you're not used to. I think anyways, let me know if you disagree. The last point I'm going to make is that you could have sex before a game if it does not impact your ability to sleep and recover appropriately, and if it's not accompanied by drugs, smoking, or alcohol, or anything else that could impair that ability to recover and perform adequately. If you want to learn more about how alcohol impacts your athletic performance, go check out that video over there. But yeah, that's it from me today, guys. I hope you learned something. I always kind of find it a little frustrating when the research is a bit gray, but I mean, that's science. From what I've seen in the process of researching this video, I do think the research tends to lean towards sex being a positive thing for performance and psychology, but it really is so individual. So please do what is best for you, and don't abstain from sex just because it's something that your coach is telling you to do, because the support and the literature just really isn't there for this myth. And this goes without saying, but just because someone like one of the athletes that I mentioned earlier are doing something doesn't mean you have to do it. And it certainly doesn't mean that what they're doing is the rule for how all athletes should behave in order to achieve a certain level of athletic performance. What do you guys think on this topic? I know it maybe is a little controversial, I don't know. Have the most amazing week ahead, everybody. Please make sure to like and subscribe, guys, so that you can help the channel grow. It would be really amazing to see some support, and I truly appreciate each and every one of you. I'll see you all next time, guys. Bye.